So welcome everyone to WeCREATE Inspiration Session 3. The topic this time is on responsible AI. I'm the session moderator, Evgeny Savelyev, and the session lead is Professor Michaela van der Schel. First, just very briefly, the purpose of WeCREATE as this engagement session that we run is primarily to inspire female students and young professionals to embrace creative careers in engineering, computer science, applied maths, AI, just STEM in general, to dispel widely held myths and old established views in these areas. It's also to highlight amazing, diverse role models that we can find. And finally, as a general note, the sessions are created for women, but they're open to all, and really nobody should be discouraged from pursuing AI and machine learning as a career path. Michaela, do you have any introductory words to add as well?
No, I am just very excited to have Jen, Emily, and Leah join us today.
Yes, fantastic.
I do not know whether you have the slides.
I have an introduction for, yeah.
You can introduce them formally, and I can introduce them informally afterwards.
Yes. We'll do it just very quickly. Just this is the timing. Just a reminder again, as you get questions from our panelists, drop them in the chat, please. That's the main thing. So now I'll just give a quick formal introduction to our panelists. Today we're very excited to have Dr. Jen Wardman-Volgan. She is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research over in New York City. She currently focuses on responsible AI, including transparency, interpretability, and fairness. Her research background is in machine learning and algorithmic economics, and she's especially interested in the interaction between people and AI systems. She completed her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 2009 and subsequently spent years as a computing innovation fellow at Harvard. She has received multiple prestigious awards, including a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Then, of course, we're very excited to have Dr. Leah Goers. She is a senior AI/ML engineer for responsible AI at GSK. She works on a responsible AI in drug discovery and clinical applications. She initially joined GSK AI as an AI fellow, where her research focused on unsupervised representation learning, causal discovery, and uncertainty estimation. Leah received a PhD in computational neuroscience from University College London, prior to which she studied natural sciences at the University of Cambridge. And finally, we also are excited to have Dr. Emily Denton. Dr. Emily Denton, them, is a staff research scientist at Google within the Technology, AI, Society, and Culture team. Their recent research interests are on emerging text and image-based generative AI. Prior to joining Google, Emily received a PhD in computer science from the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University, and their Bachelor of Science was from in computer science and cognitive science from the University of Toronto. And now Michaela can perhaps give us some more info.
Yeah, let me just say that I'm unbelievably thankful to Jen, Emily, and Leah for joining me, and I'm also very excited to have them be part of our panel today. So I'm excited because I know Jen from the time in which we were both professors at UCLA. I'm not going to say that this has been a long time ago, but I'm going to say that Jen was a fantastic collaborator, and we had fantastic fun together, supervising students. And every time I see Jen, I'm excited and I'm delighted to have such a fantastic collaboration with her in the past, and I hope that I'll have an opportunity to work again in the future. Then Emily, I met while I was visiting NYU Courant, and NYU wanted to brag about the fantastic PhD students they have, and they presented me with Emily. And indeed, I was blown away about the quality of the students Courant produces. So it's wonderful to see you, Emily, now as a researcher, as a fantastic researcher, and to see how much your career has progressed, and so wonderful to see you and have you on this panel. And finally, Leah, I know you for the least amount of time, but we met relatively recently, and I was very excited from the very beginning about the amount of energy that our interactions had. And we got talking about responsible AI, and this led to really a beginning collaboration that I hope will continue. So thank you all very much for being here. And the best is to ask actually our three panelists to introduce themselves. But what I want to ask them to do is to tell you, the audience, why they believe that this research area of machine learning and AI, and especially responsible AI, is exciting, is creative, and maybe give us a few examples from your work that can make it come alive for our audience. So Jen, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be talking to all of you today. Yeah, I think you gave a very nice introduction already, but let me tell you a little bit about my current research and some of what I'm thinking about and what I do at Microsoft. So I work on responsible AI with an aim of moving from principles to practice. So thinking about how do we actually take all of this and everything that's coming out of the research literature and make it work in real life, right, in an industry context. A big area of my focus there is transparency. And with transparency, I take a very broad view. So anything to do with disclosing information about an AI model or system in order to enable appropriate human understanding. Okay, so this might be a functional understanding of what a model or system can do, so exposing its goals and overall capabilities and limitations, or it might be more of a mechanistic understanding, so how does the model or system actually work? Within this space, I take a human-centered approach. So what I mean by this is that I try to design and evaluate approaches to transparency with particular humans, right, stakeholders, and their goals in mind. So this may be, developers who are trying to debug a model that they're building or determine whether it's ready to launch. This might be designers who are trying to build an application using a model. These days, often large language models, what do they need to know if they want to ideate about how to use this model and kind of design with it? It may be end users. End users need to be able to control an application's behavior and achieve appropriate levels of trust and reliance. In some cases, it's regulators. In some cases, it's people who are impacted by systems, and so on. All of these different stakeholders have different needs. And when we think about transparency, we really need to think about what approach will work in what scenario. I would say that one place that creativity really comes up here is in measurement, right? So how do we actually know that when we have some approach to transparency, it's actually achieving our goals? And I will say that trying to answer this question has led me on a pretty winding career path, and I have made a pretty big switch in methods that I use, the communities that I interact with, and so on, in pursuit of trying to answer these types of questions. So my background initially was in machine learning, very much on the technical, mathematical, algorithmic side. So, I was designing algorithms, trying to analyze them, prove guarantees about whether they would work or in what settings they would work or how well, and so on. This was kind of my PhD training. But once I started moving into responsible AI and caring about all of these questions to do with transparency in particular, but fairness and other things as well, I realized that to me, the interesting and important questions here are not always the mathematical questions, but the questions about people and the what we call socio-technical context in which systems will be used. So this got me, talking to colleagues from psychology who I collaborate with, a lot of colleagues in human-computer interaction, HCI. A lot of the work that I do now is kind of more HCI research than machine learning. And it ended up, I ended up getting into kind of running behavioral experiments and the style of psychology research, engaging in some more qualitative research, where we go out and interview people who are building or being influenced by systems or interacting with them to try to understand what things are like in practice, and so on. And I think that all of this is needed with transparency in particular to really make sure that our approaches are having the impact that they're intended to, because in the end, what we really care about is the people and how they actually understand the model. So I'm rambling a bit here, but this is kind of why I'm excited about this area right now, both because I think it is hugely impactful and important, especially with this rise of large language models, which I'm sure we'll get into on this call, but also because it is about more than the machine learning model or the system. It's really about the people who are engaged in this whole process.
Thank you, Jen. Emily.
Hi, everyone. So that was fantastic, Jen. As you were talking, I was like, oh, there's so many points that I'm going to build on here. But first, just want to say hello. Thank you for the really kind welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Again, I'll just kind of also expand a little bit on my current research right now within Google. So I've worked on a bunch of different topics in the responsible AI space over the past several years. Data has been a really big focus of my work for a couple of years, thinking about how data sets are developed, what sorts of norms and practices are guiding how data sets are developed, what categories are structuring data, and the kind of political dimensions that can kind of come into those decisions. And more recently, I have focused a lot on emerging generative AI technology, in particular, the emerging language models and generative image models that are kind of circulating in the public in a really profound way right now. And I've been focusing on responsible development and deployment of these models, sort of with the ultimate aim of enabling generative AI technologies that are inclusive and useful, kind of beneficial for socially and culturally diverse communities. And so this kind of brings me, building off of something that Jen said, which was talking about measurement and how kind of creativity can come into measurement practices. And I think that's a really nice jumping off point for some of my work, which has focused on understanding and measuring responsible AI elements of emerging generative AI models, but really thinking about what is it that we're measuring? How are we constructing our fairness measures, our bias measures? How are we conceptualizing different types of harms and impacts of these models? And how can we connect these measurement frameworks to real experiences of individuals and communities, and experiences that they may be having with generative AI, or experiences that they may have with prior technologies that can inform how emerging generative AI technologies may impact them or their communities. And so a lot of my work recently has focused on essentially centering impacted communities as stakeholders and as experts who can and should inform what it is that we're measuring, what types of interventions should be implemented, what types of guardrails should be implemented, and so on. And so just to give like a couple really specific examples of what this looks like, I have a couple forthcoming fact papers. I wish I had a link to share because I think this is really cool work, but it'll be online very soon. But we are really interested in cultural representations of emerging text-to-image models and what potential cultural harms might be emerging either through misrepresentations or exclusions within these models. And so we took an approach of talking to individuals with, cultural knowledge and expertise through lived experience or through formal disciplinary training as media scholars, cultural anthropologists, really kind of understanding that expertise and cultural expertise can come in a variety of forms, and kind of working collaboratively with individuals who might not necessarily be, you know, responsible AI researchers and developers, but have this essential knowledge and expertise that need to be integrated into our development and evaluation practices. And so sitting down with folks in focus groups and through surveys to kind of integrate this knowledge and expertise into what we're doing. So that's a lot of what my work has focused on. I'll probably say a little bit more about those particular projects throughout the rest of this panel. But I think that's a really, really exciting aspect of this field, which is, you know, kind of really bridging. There's a lot of opportunities to bridge the social and the technical. And this is, I think, inherently creative. It's inherently interdisciplinary. It means that folks can come from a wide variety of backgrounds and perspectives and really contribute a lot to this field. And I think it's also a field where different, you know, social experiences and perspectives of the researcher, that's really, really valuable to kind of informing, you know, the research directions that we take and the agendas that shape up. And so I think it's a really exciting field to work in, a really creative field, and just like, you know, a fantastic place to be working, especially at this moment, given that AI is, you know, increasingly touching people and society and culture in so many different ways. And we're really only scratching the surface on what this is going to look like. And so there's just kind of an infinite number of really profound and important problems to be working on. And that's very exciting.
Thank you so much, Emily. Leah.
Yeah, I completely agree with Emily, actually. And I love this idea of a community-informed measurement of responsible AI, or some of the things you're trying to measure, not just using like same old metrics. I think what I do is the research is more applied. Basically, my team's role is to help the different teams at GSK, which build software along the whole drug development pipeline, to make sure that what they're building is safe and responsible and reliable. So that, like, in itself is like sort of like there's great variety, which I really enjoy. But maybe I can pick sort of like one topic that we've worked on recently, which is selective prediction. This comes up all the time in healthcare, but I'm sure also in other fields. And it's a very interesting issue that we're looking at, both from ethical, but also the machine learning perspective. So just like for the machine learning aspect, we've mostly done applied research, you know, adopting maybe something like out of distribution methods to a data set of histopathology images from a clinical trial. And while it's creative to come up with these out of distribution algorithms and demonstrate that they work on ImageNet, in my experience, you need to be equally creative to really sort of tweak and improve them and actually get them to work on real world data. Like, this is a really hard problem in many cases. So you need to, you know, throw your full creativity at it to find a solution. And then, well, not just is it creative, but it's also really exciting when you know that eventually this will go into the clinic and help people. And then on the ethical side, we're working together with some ethics researchers from Stanford and looking into, for example, under what conditions is it morally acceptable to deploy machine learning-based systems that have been trained on data sets that often underrepresent certain groups that have been disadvantaged historically in other settings as well. And this is a pretty interesting issue that I think we need to figure out as a society if we want to deploy AI systems in practice. And yeah, the piece I'm working with Michaela right now is similarly on like how can we responsibly deploy machine learning models in the face of this issue of non-representative data sets. And so I think this also nicely links to Emily's work. It's really, like she said, it's a really interesting area to be in at the moment.
Thank you so much. Let me now go back to each one of you, but ask you very briefly, if you can, in just 1 minute, no more. Can you give me, please, your definition of responsible AI? What do you think this area encompasses? And then as a second question, also very brief, such that we can go to multiple questions and then the audience can jump in as well. So the first definition of responsible AI as succinctly as you possibly can. And secondly, just very one sentence as to what is unique in your industry about responsible AI. Emily, can I start with you this time? And then maybe Leah and then Jen.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think of responsible AI development as equitable, accessible, inclusive AI that is developed with very careful consideration to short and medium and long-term impacts, where I'm thinking also at impacts to individuals, perhaps direct or indirect impacts through, using or being exposed to a particular technology, impacts to communities, impacts to society, impacts to culture. So kind of thinking at all of these different, scopes and scales. And then also responsible AI to me is really about kind of recognizing and connecting AI to existing sociocultural marginalizations that people and communities might experience. And so kind of recognizing how structural inequality might influence how people experience AI, but also how that influences how AI is developed. And so I kind of bring this perspective into all of the different topics that we might think about as falling within the responsible AI bubble. So, fairness is a big topic, transparency is a big topic, accountability is a big topic, trust, all of these topics, I think it's important to look at through a lens of equity, accessibility, inclusivity, and kind of understand how we can conceptualize and operationalize these efforts within this broader kind of socio-technical view of the space. So I think I kept that to a minute, and I'll stop there because it's hard to summarize in a very short period of time.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what I should add here, but basically,
maybe what is unique in your industry, Leah?
Oh yeah, I mean I can say something about that, but before I do that, I would say responsible AI. You can of course see it as this umbrella or collection of fields like fairness, human-machine interaction, interpretability. I would also throw things like good software engineering and good machine learning practices in there. But more than a collection of fields, I think of responsible AI more like an imperative, like a mindset. When you are building a model, are you thinking about the impact it's going to have? What could go wrong? And what are you doing about that? So yeah, maybe that summarizes Emily's point. I think in pharma, what's maybe unique or interesting about responsible AI is that because we use machine learning at both sort of the very early stages of drug discovery, target identification, all the way to developing something like clinical decision support tools for doctors. We have like a huge variety of problems and accordingly huge variety of approaches of responsible AI that we use. But because in healthcare, when we do it, patients' well-being is impacted, the stakes are potentially very high. So I think this is different, and also, unlike many other industries, pharma is highly regulated because of this, and rightly so. So there's another framework for like safety that you have to take into account and that you have to fit responsible AI into.
Let me jump in. So just, I really like the definition that Emily gave, but just to riff off of that definition a bit, I usually think about responsible AI as kind of figuring out what your principles are and what it is that you believe in, and making sure that you are developing and evaluating and deploying AI systems kind of in a way that prioritizes your principles. So, there are all of these principles that are set forth by companies and institutions, and there are hundreds of papers and statements by companies that have put forth different principles that could be things like transparency, fairness, inclusivity, and so on. Emily mentioned being equitable and accessible, and we don't necessarily have to agree on a particular set of principles, but we should be taking the time to think through what it is that we believe in and make sure that we're developing in a way that prioritizes that. So that's how I think about responsible AI. Within Microsoft, I would say that one of the big challenges that we have that make it a little bit different, although I think things are the same at many large tech companies actually, is that we just have such a broad range of products and such a broad range of different types of AI systems and models. And it's very hard to come up with a way to put responsible AI into practice that will cover everything, the wide spectrum of what we do. So we have actually, over the last 5 years or so, developed a whole governance framework about responsible AI. We call it the Responsible AI Standard. And it's been hugely challenging trying to do this in a way that covers all of these super different domains and applications and use cases. And now trying to figure out how to kind of take this standard and put it into practice across such a wide diversity of cases is really, really challenging, I think, for us.
Thank you. So let's move a little bit and try to understand less what has been done, but what still needs to be done. So what areas of responsible AI do you think still need to be developed, and why? And again, maybe a very brief round. Maybe this time I start with you, Leah, and then Jen, and then Emily.
Sure. Yeah. So like from, I guess, if bringing in like the healthcare perspective, I think that data-centric AI and especially real-world data-centric AI is still underdeveloped. And it's both like very exciting potentially because of the big impact, but also really challenging just because of the nature of real-world data. That's usually nothing like you want it to be. And you know, coming back to this is what requires creativity. This is why it's a very interesting place to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's hard to answer this because I feel like there's so much to do. Like we're just barely scratching the surface so far. But I mean, an obvious big one is figuring out what all of this means and how to apply everything that we've done so far in this context of large generative models, and figuring out how to take our principles and understand how to apply these principles and deal with the new challenges and new types of stakeholders that we haven't seen in the past and all of this. And this is something, you know, we're obviously thinking about a huge amount, but it's going to take a lot of creativity because we have all of these existing techniques that we've developed for kind of smaller scale, more specialized models to do things like measure and mitigate unfairness and other harms. And a lot of these techniques just don't make sense. A lot of the metrics that we use don't make sense when we think about generative AI. And I strongly believe that the principles still hold, but figuring out how to actually, you know, measure, mitigate, put things into practice is going to, you know, we need all the help that we can get in this space. It is a big problem.
Similarly, I'm like, what to add? Because I was going to say putting things into practice is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Again, kind of building on, you know, what you said also in your opening, Jen. You know, I think we have a good kind of foundation of methods, of, you know, approaches to thinking about these really deep problems. But putting things into practice is extremely challenging. And again, putting things into practice with these, you know, new emerging models that are advancing quite rapidly, that are very general purpose in nature, that kind of actually break a lot of the ways in which we think about measurement. So one thing that I've always thought about when it comes to measurement is the more you can understand how is something being used, the more you can articulate what is the kind of landscape of risks and harms associated with this technology. But general purpose models that people are coming to for such a wide range of use cases and purposes, and coming to from such a broad set of perspectives with different mental models about how they work, like that just really, really, really complicates all of the ways in which we know how to evaluate these models and the kinds of interventions that we know how to put on them. So I'm kind of just echoing what everyone has already said, just want to like really emphasize that's a huge challenge. And then the one other thing that I'll add is I think a really key challenge is kind of localizing responsible AI to specific sociocultural contexts. So some colleagues of mine a couple of years ago published a great paper. I'll drop it in. This is a couple of years old now. You know, basically focusing on how a lot of responsible AI frameworks thus far have been, you know, developed and situated within a Western context. And this is a big focus of my team right now, is thinking about how we can, you know, kind of extend and expand our frameworks. Again, with the recognition that, you know, evaluations, interventions, all of these things are going to be socially and culturally situated. And so we need to, you know, be really thinking about all of these different global contexts. But that adds a challenge because, you know, AI is being developed and used in a global context. And so there's so many different social and cultural contexts that we need to consider. And that, again, poses challenges when we're trying to translate high-level principles into practice.
Thank you so much. Let me now say that in preparation for this session today, because my lab is working, among other things, quite a lot recently on data-centric AI, my students told me you need to ask the three panelists, how do they think is the role, what do they think is the role of data? And is this new upcoming agenda of data-centric machine learning, how does that interplay and how does that relate to responsible AI? So what is the role of data? And maybe even in addition, not only just data, but the data-centric agenda, and how can this intersect with responsible AI? I'm not sure who should I start. Does any of you want to start with this? Or
I can jump in.
Yeah,
I can jump in because I feel like I'll set the stage. I'm going to say a bunch of high level things and then maybe pass it off for folks to you know, dive into some specifics. Because data is something that I've thought a lot about in my research career. And I think one important perspective when thinking about data is not only to think about individual data sets and how they are structured and how individual data sets contribute to you know, different system behavior, but also understanding how data operates as a kind of structuring mechanism within the AI research field. And this is sort of thinking about how, you know, we have a practice in this community of developing benchmark data sets that get sort of institutionalized as these go-to you know, measurement devices within the field. And so data sets end up not only, you know, being the kind of foundation of particular models, but the foundation of entire research agendas, and kind of end up shaping the questions that the field asks, the dominant ways of measuring, again, both you know, performance of a particular model, but also kind of tracking progress towards larger term aims within the field. And so I think this is a really, really important kind of lens with which to look at data sets, is not just what is in this particular data set and how that pertains to a model's performance, but what is this data set and the metrics associated with it signaling to our field and shaping the direction of the field. And then I think one other thing there is, you know, who is developing the big data sets that are shaping the direction of the field? Because, you know, folks who are developing them are ultimately shaping key research agendas within the field. Okay, so I'll stop there because that's a very like big picture answer to this. But I do think that kind of looking at all of those different scales is really important when we think about responsible, you know, data development. And of course, that also has lots of implications for, you know, who is represented in the data set, who is shaping the data set, so on and so forth. But I'll pause there for now.
Yeah, maybe I can take it and sort of like bring it down one level, which so I think of, you know, data doesn't just shape the field and sort of like how we measure things, obviously, but like more immediately, data shapes your model. But machine learning data sets don't reflect the world. Actually, not even real world data sets reflect the world very well. If anything, they reflect how the world used to be, but they don't reflect how we want the world to be going forward or how we want our models to behave in sort of the best possible way. And so this question of how do we make sure that the data sets we use for machine learning actually reflect how we want our models to behave, I think is a very big question. Like unrepresentativeness in data sets is so prevalent in healthcare. I guess it's prevalent everywhere, and like figuring out what we can do about it, both at sort of like data set level in terms of like collecting more data, using extra methods like synthetic data, how we can maybe, if we, you know, there's only so much you can do, what you can then do to the model, or then even if you've tried to address some of it with the model, then there's probably more you should do when you deploy it in terms of like who gets to use it, etc. So like it's a huge sort of unsolved problem with like many different levels at which you can try and address it, and you probably need all of it.
Yeah. I mean, yes, a lot has been said already. Data is so important. I think, you know, the data-centric viewpoint is in some ways new, but it's also something that has been really prominent, I would say, in the responsible AI and fact community from the start. Like, we can't really think about responsible AI without thinking about data. And actually, when I first started kind of working in the responsible AI space, one of the first projects that I worked on was the development of what we call data sheets for data sets, which is basically documentation for data sets. This was back around 2017, I think we were working on this. It was led by Timnit Gebru, and she was a postdoc at Microsoft. And, you know, people say, I start to tell people about this and they're like, oh, documentation is so boring. Why are we talking about documentation? I don't want to think about that. But I think it's so important. And it's important for a lot of reasons, but one that gets overlooked is the importance of reflection. And you know what I mean there is that we want people who are creating or curating data sets to document them partially so that they actually stop and think through the assumptions that they're making underneath. Like, and I am, you know, assuming that, you know, this feature that I have is meaningful, or this is going to be a good predictor of something in the real world. What is it that I'm actually assuming? What's going into that? And does it make sense? Do I actually have the data that can solve the problem I'm trying to solve? This reflection needs to be done both by the people who are creating data sets, but also by people who go out and find these data sets later and want to think about whether they make sense for use in their own models, in the systems that they're building themselves. So I think that just getting people to stop and think and write things down about their data can go a really long way. Again, this is kind of another huge challenge that I don't even know how to think about when we're thinking about large generative models, because the data is basically everything, and how do you even think about that? But I think it's really important. The other thing that I'll just mention in terms of the research community is that I think that there needs to be more done to reward people who are doing the data work, because traditionally this has been very unglamorous. But I think that we are moving in good directions there. And for example, NeurIPS, which is one of the bigger machine learning conferences now, has a data sets track where you can actually publish papers about the data work that you're doing. And I think this kind of rewarding this type of work will go a long way to getting more people into it and kind of recognizing how important it is.
Thank you. Maybe it's time now, Evgeny, to turn over to you.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to ask our panelists. I think this is, of course, now quite a popular topic, but in the era of large language models and now even multimodal large models, so to speak, does responsible AI take on new dimensions? Are there like big emerging new challenges that need to be addressed. I don't know, perhaps Emily, you briefly sort of touched upon this. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good question. I think the short answer is yes. There's new challenges. I think one thing that I touched upon already is the very general purpose nature of a lot of these new models. I think this makes, this makes evaluations particularly hard because, by evaluations, I mean both kind of technical model evaluations, but also assessments of impacts at a kind of more social level. And this is quite difficult because, harms and impacts, I'll say impacts, both positive and negative impacts are very socially situated and contextual. And so having models that are not, isolated to a particular domain, but, maybe used across such a wide range of use cases and contexts and by such a massive global user base, that makes it extremely difficult to kind of understand what is the landscape of things that we need to be concerned about. So I think that's obviously one big challenge. And I think another one is really, I see with this generative AI, this is an instance where a lot of people around the world are interfacing directly with AI technology in a very new way that we haven't seen before. People, of course, have been interfacing with AI in many different ways for a very long time, but have not necessarily known it as such. People might not think of their social media feed recommendations as AI, or their, movie recommendations as AI. So this is a kind of new type of thing. And so I think there's this huge question around what expectations are people coming to these tools with? What kind of trust or lack of trust do they have in these tools? How is that going to influence, how someone understands, answers that are given or images that are generated? What are the kind of mental models, that people have of these tools? This also points to kind of, interventions, right? Like what kinds of, bounds do we need to put on these tools? What types of, public AI education needs to come with these tools? And also opens up a lot of really interesting research questions around, kind of guardrails, interventions that are oriented more at a design level rather than the kind of technical model level. Because, when I think of like generative AI, one very common topic that comes up, right, is, how, if you ask a question or if you ask, a generative image model to produce an image, everything's going to be underspecified. And so some frame of reference is going to come through in the response, right? We sort of talk about this in the fact community is like, you can't debias a model. There's always going to be some perspective there. And when you have a global user base, when you have people coming to these models for such a broad range of tasks, you're not going to be, there's no perfect answer, right? There's no ground truth. And so anything that is produced is going to be, biased from some perspective or embed some particular lens and frame of reference. And so that no longer becomes, there's not like a technical solution to that, right? It's sort of like a design question, right? Maybe we, prompt the user to be more specific. Maybe we give a response, but then have a little pop-up that's like, hey, you're asking about this, go learn more, right? There's all sorts of really, really, really interesting kind of design questions that come in here. And it's, again, I feel like we've just kind of started to scratch the surface on what are even the research questions to ask here, given that in the past 6 months, we are just seeing people interact with these tools in such radically different ways. And so now we can really, really start to study these things empirically and understand, how do we move forward in this new landscape? But it's so new, it's so fast paced that causes a lot of challenges. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you very much. I think given the time, we should now move on to actually audience Q&A. We have quite a number of fantastic questions here. So I will, I think, pick someone to To get started, when I call your name, if you're still here, if you could please unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be fantastic. So we have a question from Himanshi here. Would you be able to please go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my question is about fairness in machine learning. So based on my research on this field, I've realized that the statistical fairness metrics are often not, they're not compatible with each other, and it's very difficult to choose which metric would be applicable to your problem, because you might not know how the data is biased in the first place. And I feel like that conversation was missing in a lot of research spaces where we're trying to solve the problem of fairness without really knowing the nature of the bias in the data. And so I think causality and causal discovery is a huge field that would contribute a lot to this conversation. But also in a larger context, my question is related to my organization, where I'm trying to have this responsible AI and fair ML conversation, but it's very difficult to actually talk about this when I'm not really sure how to put it in terms that they would practically understand, and this work is largely limited to academic circles. So is there something that we could do to make this part of the more mainstream conversation that happen around AI?
I don't know if someone wants in particular to kick this off. If not, Jen, maybe you could.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different questions in there. Let me pick up on this last question about, how we can try to talk to people about this. I think if I'm understanding the question right, it was how we can try to talk to people about issues like fairness in machine learning, when it's the case that a lot of the research literature out there is pretty technical and dense and not really easy to convey. I think this is a great question. It depends in some sense who your audience is that you're thinking about. So, I mean, I think that these days, it's getting increasingly important that for people who are going into fields like technology, say someone who is who's majoring in computer science in college, I would argue that they should be getting training in, in ethics, in some of these, ways of thinking. It really is kind of a mindset more than anything as part of their education, and not just in kind of a one-off side class, kind of putting ethics into this one-off thing that you think about and never apply in your own work. But I would like to see this more as something that is brought up in the context of every class, so that people just get more used to thinking about the fact that the work that they're doing has potential impact, and thinking through what that impact is and how the decisions that they're making affect the system that they're putting out into the world, and how that in turn affects people. So I think that, this is maybe not a satisfying answer in that it's not something that you can go out and apply today, but I think we do need to be just kind of infusing these discussions into our curricula much earlier. In terms of talking to people, now I think that there have been at this point so many public cases of things going very wrong in the tech industry that just leaning on some of these more prominent examples can be a good starting place for conversation. And certainly, within the tech industry, I've seen a lot of people become more concerned about responsible AI after seeing really visible examples of things going wrong. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but.
Thank you, Jen, for that answering this very broad and developing topic. Let's then move on to a question from Arnoldo about the large language models and the regulation side of things.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful discussion so far. The big language models, right, and the generative AIs, they are owned and developed by the big corporations that, in principle, have to make profit. And the question is, how could we believe that they're interested in developing responsible instruments for mankind? And if this is not something natural that will happen in corporations, then it means that we have to do some regulation that the world has to start to control, a bit like it has been done for nuclear powers, how to use these instruments. And then the question is how to regulate and what to regulate.
It's a fantastic question. I don't know, Emily, perhaps do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can comment on this. I mean, I'll preface this with, I am, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a, regulatory expert or scholar, but I do believe in the importance of kind of establishing industry standards that, different corporate institutions or any institution developing, artificial intelligence technologies, kind of has to, meet some certain minimum standards. I think this is also, one of the, we keep kind of coming back to challenges within this field, right? Responsible AI is still a relatively new field. People have been talking about, bias, of course, in technology, for decades and decades, with some classic papers, coming out in the 90s. But responsible AI, as we know it now, is still a new field. And so I think what we've seen is, different, research communities kind of aligning on particular norms and standards, and that being implemented, for example, within academic communities, we're seeing really interesting models of kind of governance emerging that hold, publications within peer-reviewed venues to certain ethical standards, right? And we're seeing that has kind of come back to this point that Jen was making about needing to kind of infuse responsible AI into work practices. We see those kinds of mechanisms as being really important to actually making sure that responsible AI gets implemented, within our academic work. Similarly, at the corporate level, we have, different institutions, forming responsible AI principles, doing a lot of work to hold themselves accountable, to publicly stated principles, building out, teams and processes to kind of uphold, those kind of public standards or public commitments. But we don't yet have a lot of, kind of cross-industry standardization here. There's some work obviously in this, and of course it differs in different regulatory contexts, right? The EU is very different than the US, and obviously different data standards exist within the EU that shapes kinds of practices that the corporations must uphold. But I think this is a really important and open question, right? It's just like, how do we standardize our responsible AI work, and where are the places where, regulation is the right intervention point to ensure that, every single company is abiding by, a shared set of practices.
Yes, that's a great answer. Thank you very much. And let us follow up with the question from Ali, if you're still here, about conveying the importance of this to people. If you're still with us, could you please come on the microphone and enable your video? Ali, perhaps you're not here. I can briefly ask this question. And the question basically is that did you encounter any difficulties when conveying the concept and importance of responsible AI to stakeholders? And do you have any questions for overcoming these challenges? Leah, perhaps
yeah, sure. So my experience is actually that people want to do the right thing, and they want to engage, and they want to build the things they build responsibly. I think the problem also, the challenge is that because there are so many differing aspects to responsible AI, you need to be aware of differing priorities. Like maybe you think about uncertainty estimation and guarantees and predictions, but someone else is mostly interested in fairness. So you have to be specific to the context of your application and make sure you focus not on your pet responsible AI topic, but really do a proper like impact and risk assessment, and then focus on what's the most important thing to get right in this particular application. And then I think, in my experience at least, people are open to that.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I think in the view of time, I think we can probably do just one more question. We have a question from Weina Jin. If you could perhaps, I think you have two questions. If you could just pick one of them, perhaps the second part of your question. Yeah, if you could come on the microphone and the camera, if you're still with us.
Thank you. So I would like to ask the panelists about how we can change the current curriculum in the computer science education so that we can make the next generation of computer scientists or engineer to get used to this ethical, responsible thinking. Just ask the panelists to comment. Thank you.
Fantastic question. Thank you. Jen, you mentioned education briefly. Perhaps it would be a natural question.
I feel like I already said what I have to say about this, so maybe someone else has more to add than I do.
I have a minor point to add. I think Jen's point was fantastic. The only thing I would really emphasize is interdisciplinarity, right? Sort of recognizing that, you know, AI is not a purely kind of technical domain. Responsible AI is not a purely technical domain. And so in addition to Jen's really excellent point about ensuring that ethics courses aren't kind of siloed off as a separate thing, but really infused within curriculums and integrated into kind of learning pathways in a really holistic way. Also recognizing the importance of bringing in, you know, socio-technical perspectives, you know, integrating courses and coursework, you know, outside of kind of computer science, you know, math, statistics, because again, a lot of these, not that every responsible AI researcher, you know, needs to, you know, also have a degree in the social sciences or humanities, but, you know, bringing in a little bit of that teaching and learning and perspectives and methods, I think is really important to kind of, you know, enable a really holistic understanding of responsible AI topics.
Thank you very much, Emily. And now we are going to sort of close the session. Michaela has some final remarks to make. So Michaela, if you could please go ahead.
I just want to thank very much to Jen, Emily, and Leah for making this topic such an important topic come alive and showing all the different aspects of it, all the different challenges, but also opportunities, and showing that actually it's an exciting and interdisciplinary area, and that there is an enormous opportunity to engage with it. And I want to thank you for taking time to talk to us, and hopefully everybody will be inspired and join us and join this community. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Just from me on the logistics side of things, just a final point. Please visit our website, WeCREATE.wondershala.com, and join our email list for announcements on the next sessions. Today's session will be on YouTube, perhaps over the weekend or so. And yes, please spread the word about these sessions. And thanks again for everyone attending and our panelists for providing such an informative discussion on this topic that is rapidly growing in importance. Thank you very much, everyone.